UFO went out on ITV for the first time on the 16th of September, 1970, and it showed you a world that was only 10 years away. 1980. A base on the moon, a secret defense force hidden underneath a film studio, and Gabrielle Drake in a silver suit and a purple wig counting an interceptor down. 56 years have gone by since that night. One of the women who stood on that Moonbase set is in England this month, 91 years old, and you have watched her son on television dozens of times without ever making the connection. Her name is Wanda Ventham, and I will come to her last. We start with the man in the white hair. Commander Ed Straker is the coldest hero British television ever gave us, and that is exactly why he worked. No jokes, no speeches, a film producer's office in Harlington Straker Studios, a secretary, a cigarette box, and a lift that dropped straight down into a war nobody on Earth was allowed to know about. Other leading men of that era wanted you to like them. Straker did not seem to care whether you did. That was the strange thing about this programme. It looked like a children's teatime series, and it behaved like something else entirely. People were killed off. Marriages fell apart on screen. Straker made decisions that were plainly wrong and had to live in them for the rest of the episode. Parents who put it on for the models and the explosions found themselves watching something considerably heavier than they had bargained for. The American accent was real. The man behind it was born George Victor Bishop on the 11th of June, 1932 in Brooklyn, into a banker's family who expected something sensible from him. He very nearly gave them it. He went to Boston University to study business administration, and halfway through he walked out of it and into the drama department, which his parents did not forgive quickly. But acting had already found him somewhere far stranger than a lecture hall. He had done his national service as a disc jockey for Armed Forces Radio in Newfoundland, of all places on this earth, and to fill the long evenings he joined a local company called the St. John's Players. A young American spinning records on a cold Canadian island discovered there that he liked standing in front of people. Everything else came out of that. Then came the piece of luck that decided the rest of his life. He won a Fulbright scholarship to come to London and study, and by 1959 he had simply stopped going home. Britain got him for the next 46 years. He had to change his name to do it, mind you. There was already a George Bishop on the books, so George Victor became Ed, and Ed he stayed. Here is the credit you have almost certainly seen without knowing whose face it was. In 1968, 2 years before Shado existed, he was sitting in the cockpit of the Ares 1B moon shuttle in 2001, A Space Odyssey. Stanley Kubrick's film, the captain who welcomes Dr. Floyd aboard. He had already flown to the moon on screen before Gerry Anderson ever offered him the job of defending it. And he had already worked for the Andersons too. If you had children in the house in 1967, his voice was in your living room every week as Captain Blue in Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons. Anderson liked him, remembered him, and when the time came to put a real actor in front of a real camera instead of a puppet, he knew exactly who to ring. There is one thing about the making of UFO that almost nobody mentions, and it is worth pausing on. Straker had a superior officer, General Henderson, played by a rugged Australian-raised actor named Grant Taylor. On the 26th of January, 1971, halfway through the series' original run on ITV, Grant Taylor died of cancer in London at the age of 53. Viewers sitting down on a Wednesday evening to watch him lean across a desk and overrule Straker were watching a man who had already gone. His last episodes went out after his funeral, and nobody at the time thought to tell the audience. Ed Bishop lived a good deal longer, and he lived loudly. He was never the polite, grateful sort of actor. In 1993, he talked his way into an arms trade fair in Aldershot, dressed as General Pinochet, purely to embarrass the people selling weapons there. In March 2003, at 70, he was out on the London streets marching against the invasion of Iraq. If you ever heard him on BBC Radio in the late 70s playing Philip Marlowe in the Raymond Chandler adaptations, you will know the voice he did all of that with. Dry, amused, and completely unimpressed by anybody's authority. There were 3 marriages. The first at 22 lasted less than a year. The second to Hillary ran for 34 of them and gave him 4 children. The third came late. In 2001, at 69, he married a photographer called Jane, and they had 4 years together before he died. And in between all of that, the thing you would not wish on anybody. In 1988, a car crash in Cumbria took his son, Daniel. The boy was 20, Nothing in a working life survives a thing like that, and by every account of the people who knew him, nothing in his did. Ed Bishop died on the 8th of June, 2005, 3 days short of his 73rd birthday. He had been having treatment for leukemia, and a chest infection he picked up during it was what took him in the end. He is buried at Knapton in Warwickshire. On the headstone, at his own wish, there is a peace symbol, the last quiet joke of a man who spent a decade on television running a secret army and spent his real life shouting at the people who ran the real ones. The man who played his second-in-command was, in that same period, closer to becoming James Bond than any British actor alive. And he would get that close 4 more times and never once get the part. Second then, Colonel Paul Foster. The pilot, the one with the jaw, the one who flew Sky One, the one the audience actually fell for while Straker was busy being unbearable. Foster was the human being in that building, and if you were a teenager in 1970 watching this on a Wednesday night, he was who you wanted to be. Michael Billington was born on Christmas Eve, 1941, in Blackburn in Lancashire. Sylvia Anderson found him. She was watching an episode of The Prisoner, saw him in it, and decided he was Foster. And that was that. He was 28 years old. Now the Bond story because it is remarkable and because almost nobody tells it properly. Michael Billington was screen tested for the part of James Bond more times than any other actor in the history of the films. Not twice, not 3 times. It went on for the best part of 15 years. It began in 1969 with a photo session for On Her Majesty's Secret Service and a meeting with the director Peter Hunt. It came round again for Live and Let Die in 1973, again for Moonraker in 1979, again for Octopussy in 1983. And when Roger Moore was wavering over whether to come back for Your Eyes Only, Albert Broccoli's first choice to replace him was Michael Billington. Roger Moore came back, he always came back. And each time he came back, the man from Blackburn went home and waited another 4 years. Imagine what that does to somebody. Not one rejection which any actor can carry, but 15 years of being told, politely and repeatedly, that he was very nearly the biggest thing in British cinema. He was ITC's golden boy in the 70s. He looked the part more completely than most of the men who actually got it. And the door never opened. He did get into a Bond film in the end, and you have seen it, though you may not have realised who you were looking at. The Spy Who Loved Me, 1977, the pre-title sequence in the snow, before the ski jump and the parachute. The Russian agent in bed with Barbara Bach who gets up, goes out and is shot dead within about 3 minutes of the film starting. That is him, Sergei Barsov, the nearest thing to Bond that Britain had, cast as the man Bond's people kill in the opening. He was for 8 years the partner of Barbara Broccoli, the daughter of the producer whose door he kept being invited through and never quite walked past. Around 1979, he moved to America to try to make it there, stayed about 6 years, and could not make Hollywood care the way ITV had. He came home. He married Catherine Christoph in 1988, and they had a son, Michael. His last real television work was a series called The Collectors in 1986, and his final credit of any kind was an episode of Maigret in the early 90s. Then, essentially, nothing. Michael Billington died of cancer on the 3rd of June 2005 at Margate in Kent. He was 63 years old. 5 days later, Ed Bishop died. Straker and Foster, the 2 men at the centre of that programme, gone inside the same week after 34 years apart. He never got the part. But go and look at that opening sequence again and watch what he does with 3 minutes of screen time and barely a line of dialogue. He is 35 years old, and he is completely, effortlessly, the thing they kept telling him he might one day be allowed to become. The third of Shadow's senior officers had never acted at all until he was 35 years old. And what he was doing for a living before that is the strangest list of jobs in this entire story. Colonel Alec Freeman is the one you would have wanted to work for. Straker's oldest friend, the only man in the organisation allowed to tell him he was wrong, and the only person in that concrete corridor who ever looked like he might go to the pub afterwards. He is in the first 17 episodes, and then he is quietly gone, and the programme is noticeably colder without him. George Sewell was born on the 31st of August 1924 in Hoxton in East London. His father printed things and his mother sold flowers, and he left school at 14, which was ordinary for a Hoxton boy in 1938. Now hold on to what comes next, because he did not walk into a rehearsal room until he was in his mid-30s. He trained as an RAF pilot and finished too late to fly in the war. He repaired bomb-damaged houses in London afterwards. He went to sea with Cunard as an oil trimmer. Filthy, hot work down in the engine spaces of the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth on the Atlantic run. He took photographs of people in the street and sold them the prints. He worked as assistant to a French roller skating act. He played drums in a rumba band and ended up running their bookings. He shepherded holidaymakers around on a motor coach. That is the working life of a man who had already lived a whole one before anybody paid him to pretend. What changed it was a conversation in a pub. He got talking to the actor Dudley Sutton, who told him to go and see Joan Littlewood at the Theatre Workshop in Stratford East. He did. He walked on as a policeman in Things Ain't What They Used to Be, went into the West End with it, and 3 years later he was playing Field Marshal Hague in Oh, What a Lovely War. From a coach courier to Hague in 4 years, starting at 35. The face did the rest. It was a hard, watchful London face that told you nothing, and for the next 40 years British television used it for policemen and criminals more or less interchangeably. If you have seen Get Carter, he is in it. If you were watching ITV in 1973 and 1974, he was Detective Chief Inspector Alan Craven in Special Branch, which is the programme the Sweeney was built on top of. And if you have children who grew up on Doctor Who, he turned up in Remembrance of the Daleks in 1988 and frightened them properly. His brother Danny had been a professional boxer before he too became an actor, which tells you a certain amount about the household they came out of. George married Helen Logan Davies in 1961 and they had a child. He kept working almost to the end. His last job was an episode of Casualty in 2006, at 81 years of age. He died of cancer in London on the 2nd of April, 2007, aged 82. 47 years in the business, and he only got into it because he happened to stand next to the right man at a bar. We are about a third of the way through, and the question underneath all of this is still open. Of the people who stood on that Moonbase set at Borehamwood in 1969, how many are still with us in 2026? Stay with me, because 2 of the answers are genuinely lovely. And the next man in the Shadow building had been in a Nazi camp at 16, escaped from it twice, and was recommended for the role that made him famous all over the world by James Bond himself. 4th in our tour of that building, and by a distance the hardest life of anybody in it. Dr. Doug Jackson, Shadow's psychiatrist, the one with the accent and the file and the very quiet questions. When Jackson interrogated one of their own people, you believed absolutely that he had done it before. That was not acting technique, that was memory. He was born Władysław Szabol on the 12th of March 1923 at Zgierz, just outside Lodz in central Poland. His father was a university professor. He was 16 when the Germans came. He was imprisoned in a Nazi camp. He escaped. He was caught and he escaped a second time, and he was caught again, and the second time they tortured him for it. He was a schoolboy. There is no gentler way to put any of that, and he rarely spoke about it in interviews, which is its own kind of statement. He came out of the war alive and went into the Polish theatre, and in 1957 Andrzej Wajda cast him in Kanał, the film about the fighters of the Warsaw Uprising trying to escape through the city's sewers. It is one of the great European films of that decade, and he was not even a trained professional actor when he made it. In 1958 he left Poland because he would not join the party and would not pretend to. Paris first, then Vienna, then Britain in 1959, with no money and an accent that most casting directors of the day heard as a problem rather than an asset. So he taught instead. He directed a production for Bromley Little Theatre in 1960. He staged Mussorgsky's Coven Scena at Oxford that same year. Somebody from the BBC came and saw it, and the door finally opened. Then, in 1963, the thing that put his face in front of the entire world. From Russia with Love. Kronstein, the chess grandmaster who plans Bond's murder between moves. The cold one in the glasses, and he got it because Sean Connery had seen his work and personally recommended him for it. Think about the shape of that for a moment. A boy who was tortured in a camp at 16 ends up, 24 years later, playing chess against Spectre in a Bond film on the recommendation of Bond. British television then spent 30 years casting him as every variety of dangerous foreigner it could think of, which was a waste of a man who could do a great deal more, and he took the work and did it beautifully anyway. Dr. Jackson in UFO is the best of it. He made a small part into the one you remember. Władysław Szabol died in London on the 16th of October 1992. He was 69. A ruptured aortic aneurysm, very sudden, with no warning at all. He is buried at Putney Vale Cemetery in southwest London, a long way from Sgears, and a very long way indeed from the boy who kept going back over the fence. While I have you here, and this is the part of these videos I look forward to most, I would love to know where you were watching UFO. Was it the first ITV run in 1970? Or was it in America a couple of years later? Or did you find it in a repeat somewhere at 2 in the morning? And be honest with me, did you want a Moonbase or did you want the skydiver? Tell me down in the comments. I read them all, and the ones from people who watched it first time round are the best thing in my week. The man who flew Sky 1 had a talent that programme barely used at all, and his son ended up on stadium stages around the world with one of the biggest bands this country has ever produced. Fifth, Captain Peter Carlin, Skydiver's commander, the submarine that launched an interceptor jet up through the surface of the sea, which was the single best idea in the entire series, and every 10-year-old in Britain knew it. Peter Gordeno was born Peter Goddenhoe on the 20th of June 1939 in Rangoon, in what was then Burma. His father was Italian-American and his mother was Scottish and Burmese. Almost nothing about him was ordinary, and it started there. Here is the thing UFO never let you see. The man was a dancer, a superb one. That was his real trade. Dancer, choreographer, cabaret singer, recording artist. He worked with John Barry, the composer who wrote the Bond themes. In 1968, he was on a London stage in Man of La Mancha, singing Little Bird to a full house. Then Gerry Anderson put him in a flight suit in a submarine and asked him to look serious. He went back to what he was good at afterwards. From 1979 to 1981, he fronted the television broadcast of the EMI UK and World Disco Dancing Championships, and he danced in the opening of them himself, in his 40s, better than most of the competitors. He choreographed and appeared in the very last Carry On film in 1992, and the name carried on. His son, also Peter Gordeno, is a songwriter and a keyboard player, and since 1998 he has toured the world with Depeche Mode. Every stadium that band has played this century, there has been a Gordeno up on the stage. Peter Gordeno died in London on the 18th of October 2008, aged 69, after several years of illness with cancer. We are 2/3 of the way down now, and I have not forgotten the question we started with. 3 of the people in this video are still alive in 2026, and all 3 of them are coming up one after the other right now. The woman at the console beside him had already been in one of the bravest British films of the 1950s, at a time when the industry gave people who looked like her almost nothing at all. 6th, Lieutenant Nina Barry. Purple wig, silver suit, one of the calm voices at Moonbase Control, and by the later episodes promoted to running the place. If you close your eyes and picture UFO, there is a very good chance you are picturing her. Dolores Mantes was born Dolores Mante on the 17th of October 1936 in Liverpool. Her father was Ghanaian and her mother was Irish, and Liverpool in the 30s and 40s was not an easy place to be the child of that marriage. She started as a singer and a model in the 50s, and she got into films through the front door of a genuinely important one. Sapphire 1959, directed by Basil Dearden, a murder story that was really about race in London, made at a moment when British cinema had not remotely worked out how to talk about it. She was 22. That is a serious first credit by anybody's standard. She worked steadily through the 60s, twice alongside Patrick McGoohan, before Anderson put her on the moon. Then she met a businessman called Robert Harding in a pub during a power cut, which is about as 1970s away to meet somebody as has ever been recorded. They married in 1976. When their son Rob was born, she stopped acting altogether, and she meant it. No comeback, no interviews complaining about it, no bitterness at all. But she never dropped the people. For the last 30 years of her life, she went to the conventions, sat behind the table, and let 2 generations of fans tell her what that purple wig had meant to them. Dolores Mantes died on the 30th of November 2012 at Sydenham in South London, aged 76. The other woman on that Moonbase was, at the very same time, one of the most familiar faces on British children's television, and she is still with us. 7th, and the first of 3 who are Lieutenant Ayshea Johnson at the Shadow control desk in the same silver and the same purple. Ayshea Hague was born on the 12th of November 1948 in Highgate in North London and spent part of her childhood in France. She was signed to Fontana Records as a teenager, and her first single, Eeny Meeny, came out in 1965 when she was 16. She made 8 singles and 2 albums for 6 different labels over the next 12 years, and not one of them troubled the charts. She toured with Jimmy Cliff's band, she was in the right rooms with the right people at the right time, and the hit simply never came. Television did what the records would not. From 1969, she fronted her own weekly pop show for Granada, Lift Off with Ayshea, and she made 122 episodes of it across 5 years. Her name was in the title of it. She introduced half the glam rock acts of the era to the nation's children, while the nation's children were supposed to be doing their homework, and Mark Bolan liked her enough to write her a song. Now think about what that meant in 1969. A young woman of Asian heritage, fronting her own primetime series on British television, week after week, at a time when there was quite simply nobody else doing it. Nobody made any fuss of it then. In 2024, the Asian Media Awards finally did, and gave her their Outstanding Contribution to Media Award. 55 years late, but they got there in the end. She left performing behind and made a second career as an interior designer and property developer, married and settled. And by the early 2000s, she was living quietly in Grantham in Lincolnshire. She is 77 years old, she is well, and by all accounts, she is perfectly happy that people still want to talk to her about a purple wig. The first face you ever saw on that Moonbase carried a family story that the rest of the world would not begin to understand for another 30 years. 8th. And this is the one I have been waiting to tell you. Lieutenant Gay Ellis was the commander of Moonbase in the early episodes, and she is the image the whole series is remembered by. The silver suit, the purple wig, the calm voice counting an interceptor down. If UFO exists as one single picture in your head, that picture is Gabrielle Drake. She was born Gabrielle Mary Drake on the 30th of March 1944 in Lahore, in what was then British India. Her father Rodney was an engineer out there with the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation. Her mother Molly wrote songs at home, real ones, proper ones, and recorded them on a machine in the house for nobody but the family. The Drakes came back to England when Gabrielle was 8, and 4 years after Gabrielle, in the same family, her brother Nick was born. If you know that name now, you know it because of what happened long after he had gone. Nick Drake made 3 albums between 1969 and 1972, and almost nobody bought them. He could not bear performing live. He was ill in a way that the medicine of the time had no good answer for. He died in November 1974 at his parents' house, aged 26, and at the time it barely made a paragraph anywhere. His sister was 30. She had just come off UFO and was about to start The Brothers for the BBC, the Sunday night drama that half the country watched. And for the next 50 years, alongside her own career, she has been the person who made sure the world eventually heard him. That is not a sentimental way of putting it. It is a job, and she did it. She looked after the tapes and the rights and the reputation. She said no to the things that would have cheapened him and yes to the ones that would not. In 2014, she co-wrote Nick Drake. Remembered for a while, the family's own book about him, made largely out of letters and papers she had kept for 40 years. In 2018, she stood up at the BBC Radio 2 Folk Awards and collected his place in their Hall of Fame 44 years after his death. And she did the same thing for their mother. Molly Drake's home recordings, made on a reel-to-reel machine in a Warwickshire sitting room and never intended for anyone at all, are now loved by people who were not born when she made them. Her own working life never stopped either. The Brothers made her a household name in the 70s. She ran the motel in Crossroads in the mid-80s. She turned up in Coronation Street. And she has been on stage almost continuously since 1964, in the sort of parts that do not get talked about on the internet, but keep an actor honest. In 1977, she married the South African painter Louis de Wet. And in 1983, the two of them took on Wenlock Abbey in Shropshire, a building parts of which are 900 years old, in a condition that would have frightened most people straight back out of the door. They spent the rest of their lives together restoring it, room by room, decade by decade. He died in 2018. She is still there. Before I take you to the last one, if you have got this far with me, do please tap the subscribe button. Because the woman coming up is 91 years old. She is the reason I made this video in the first place, and there is a great deal more of this to come on the channel. Gabrielle Drake is 82, she is working, and she is the guardian of two bodies of music that this country would have lost without her. She was the face of the future in 1970. She turned out to be the keeper of the past. Which brings us back to the beginning, and to the promise I made you in the first minute. The woman who is 91 this month, and the son whose face you know a great deal better than hers. Colonel Virginia Lake arrived at Shadow and immediately did the thing nobody else in the series managed. She argued with Straker and won. She was not there to be looked at, and she was not there to be rescued. In 1970, on British television, a woman in a command uniform telling the commanding officer to his face that he was wrong was not a small thing, and the programme never once apologised for it. Wanda Ventham was born on the 5th of August, 1935, in Brighton. She turned 91 12 days ago. Her training was at the Central School of Speech and Drama, and she came out of it in 1956, in the same handful of years as Judi Dench. She has now been working on and off for 7 decades, which is not a figure of speech and not a rounded-up number either. 2 years after UFO, she carried her own series, The Lotus Eaters, as Anne Shepherd, a woman running a bar on Crete with a great deal she was not saying. It is the performance her own generation of viewers remembers most, and it is the one that should have made her a star of a different order than she became. And then here is the one that will make you sit up, because you have watched it and never joined the two together. Only Fools and Horses. Cassandra's mother, Pamela Parry, Alan's wife, the one in the good coat who is faintly appalled by the Trotters and then very slowly stops being. She was in that from 1989 to 1992 at Rodney's wedding and at the dinner table, and it is the same woman who wore the Shadow uniform. She was in Heartbeat in the mid-90s too, and she was busy well into her 70s. Her private life handed her the strangest full circle in this whole story. Her first marriage to James Tabernacle gave her a daughter, Tracy, and ended in 1974. But in 1970, the very year UFO was going out on ITV, she was working on a drama called A Family at War and met an actor named Timothy Carlton. They married in April 1976, and their son is Benedict Cumberbatch, which is why between 2014 and 2017, when Sherlock needed to show you Sherlock Holmes's parents, the production did the obvious and rather lovely thing and cast his actual ones. Wanda Ventham and Timothy Carlton sitting on a sofa in Baker Street being mildly embarrassing about their brilliant son, who was their brilliant son. Millions of people watched that and never knew what they were looking at. She has never made a fuss about any of it. No memoir settling scores, no long public complaints about the parts that dried up, no trading on the family name. In 2014, at 79, an American magazine put her in its most beautiful people issue, and she found that extremely funny. So, 1980 came and went. There was no Moonbase, no skydiver, no interceptors waiting on the dark side of the moon, and the future that Gerry and Sylvia Anderson filmed at Borehamwood in 1969 is now further behind us than it was ever ahead of them. 26 episodes, £2.5 million, 17 months of work, and a second series that was commissioned, cancelled, and quietly turned into something else entirely. But go and look at it again. Look at the silver corridors and the purple wigs and the cigarette smoke and the strange, serious, grown-up mood of a programme that was supposedly made for children on a Wednesday evening. Then think about who was standing inside those costumes. A Brooklyn disc jockey who came to London on a scholarship and stayed. A boy from Sgears who went over a camp fence twice. A Hoxton coach courier who did not act until he was 35, a Liverpool girl whose parents came from Ghana and Ireland, a young woman who would spend the next 50 years making sure her brother's songs were finally heard. 3 of them are still here. Ayshea is 77. Gabrielle Drake is 82 and still walking onto a stage. And Wanda Ventham is 91 in England, quietly getting on with it while her son fills cinemas all over the world. They filmed a future that never arrived. What they left behind instead was better, and it is still going.